Good morning. It is time for us to do one more lesson on Romans. This is the last week of the quarter. It's been an interesting and sometimes speedy fly through Romans, especially when you consider a couple of weeks that were affected due to weather. So because of that, I've been kind of doing a recap to get everybody together and looking at the context. But I'm just going to hit that really quick today and jump right in because I want to do a review at the end. So here we are. We've got 3 more chapters to go today. We're helped a little bit by the fact that the last couple of chapters, I'm not going to say they aren't important, but they're not as meaty and difficult to understand as some of those early chapters. Also, as Paul usually does, he spends a good bit of time in his towards the end, and that'll be that last chapter, sending greetings to people and sending greetings from people. So that means we're probably just going to skip over that. So here we are. We've got three chapters to go. Our quick review, the context that we've had in Romans is Paul spends the first 11 chapters setting out some teachings on sin and faith and righteousness and especially grace. But early on, we kind of established that there was apparently some friction between the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians, because there are numerous places where Paul will seemingly address one group or the other. And a lot of that is in those first 3 chapters when he's driving home the fact that all of them have sinned. They all start from that same place as being a sinner and in need of grace. Just as a quick recap, because the last few chapters from 12 to the end is more of okay, now that you've been studying where you are and how grace works, this is how you apply it, and this is how it changes the way you interact with people and live your life. So just to do a quick review of grace, it is an undeserved benefit, unearned. Okay, so getting into chapter 14. As we said, the last couple of chapters, 12 and 13, we talked about last week, was a lot of how like the beginning of 12, how you interact in the church. They were apparently having some disagreements over different roles that people would have in the church and the people using the skills that God gave them. Chapter 13 talks a lot about submission to government. And includes in there some things about how you live your life. To me, the highlight of that chapter is, owe no one anything except love. So then we get into chapter 14. And 12 and 13 had several shorter sections that talked about one issue or one aspect than another. Paul spends basically the entire chapter 14 and a little bit into 15 talking about a couple of related issues. So if we look at the beginning of the chapter, verses 2 and 3, if someone would read those for me, please.
One person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Let him, let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let him not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him.
Okay, thank you. So here we are. We have a debate over food. Where have we recently, as in a quarter or two ago, discussed a debate over what type of food we eat? Perhaps in Corinthians, where there was a similar debate among two different groups over what type of food they ate. Now this one may be a little bit different, I will admit. Who remembers what the debate from 1 Corinthians was? Food offered to idols, yes. Some would have attached, even though, and we talked about this in Corinthians, Paul was telling them, listen, said, idols are nothing. They don't, you worship the one true God. These idols are nothing. But yet some people would have qualms about eating that meat. And I'll be honest, for years and years, I have read Romans, and I've pretty much lumped that into the same issue. And I'm not saying it's not. But then as I started reading, there were several like commentary writers that pointed out, well, maybe this was having to do with clean versus unclean, because the Jews had that history. And I don't know that there's anything here that actually specifies which this one is. It's not specific enough. But I don't know that it matters, because whichever issue this was, or maybe it was both, whichever issue this is, we have a disagreement between two different groups. Then a couple of verses later, we read verse 5. One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. So now we have a debate over special days. And again, it's not completely specific what the issue is, but one could reasonably make the assumption that this is keeping the Sabbath, keeping the Passover, keeping those feast days that the Jews would have had a long history. And of course, being a mix of Jewish and Gentile Christians, there would have been different backgrounds, maybe different beliefs over that. So now looking at Paul after all this time talking about grace, and then he talks about how you interact with how people lead worship in chapter 12, and how you use those gifts and how you interact with people. He gets into this chapter, and the same things are going to apply. You need to be acting with grace and reflecting the grace that you've been given in your dealing with other people. So how does Paul tell them to act? To be honest, he brackets it. He starts off in verse 1 as saying, as for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. So he starts off saying, okay, we've got these differences of opinion, and you should not be quarreling about them. I think it's interesting that he then goes on to each of those debates, the debate over food or the debate over special days. He gives pretty much the same answer. And we hinted on it there in the second part of verse 3. Would someone read verse 4? And then someone read verse 10. 10.
Why do you pass judgment on your brother? Or you, why do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God.
Okay. Why do you pass judgment? We're all going to stand before the judge. So the way I put it is he gives them the don't answer. He's telling them don't have this response, because this is not the response that shows grace. But even better, he gets in and he follows it up again multiple times. In verses 13 and 9. So he's telling them, okay, you shouldn't be passing judgment on your brother in these differences of opinion. But then he gets into verse 13. He says, therefore, let us not pass judgment, he's continuing that thought, on one another any longer, but rather what? What's that next line say? Decide never to do what? Never to put a stumbling block. So now instead of just saying, watch yourself, don't judge them, he's saying you need to take an active decision in the way you react. And you need, again, with acting with grace, to never put a stumbling block in the way. And then in verse 19, and I'll jump ahead. This is our memory verse for this chapter. So then let us pursue what makes for peace and for mutual upbuilding. This is the do answer. So we've got the thing not to do, and then he says, okay, this is the way that you do need to react. Man, I had some stuff planned, but I'm just not going to have time for it. We're going to have to move along. And then I'll finish this chapter with verse 23. But whoever has doubts is condemned if he eats, because the eating is not from faith. For whatsoever does not proceed from faith is sin. What one word do you think of when you read this verse? Doubt. Okay. Something else? I thought of conscience, but doubt is the key word. If your conscience is in doubt, if you are unsure, whoever does not proceed from faith, does not proceed from faith is sin. So he's telling them, on one side, this is how you react to others, but then he's reinforcing the fact that if you are not acting from faith, if you are doing something that you think is sin, then you're sinning. So he's giving them, all sides of this difference of opinion. So conscience matters. If you are in that situation, I guess, if you are the weaker brother, then you still need to avoid those things that do make you feel guilty. Mm-hmm.
You skipped over verse 21, and I think that kind of sums up a lot of it. I don't know if you did that on purpose or not. But it is good neither to eat meat, nor drink wine, nor do anything by which your brother stumbles or is offended or made weak. So the response is, those who are stronger, don't do things that, and it goes back to what we studied in 1 Corinthians with the same thing. Paul resolved he would not eat meat if it would cause his brother to stumble.
Mm-hmm. I didn't skip over it for any particular reason other than time. Hopefully that is encompassed with verse 19. Pursue what makes for peace and mutual upbuilding. But you're right. And that's actually something of a good transition into chapter 15. The beginning of 15 really is starting to sum up chapter 14. So it says, "We then who are strong have an obligation to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves." So, chapter 14 was people who are weak versus people who are strong in terms of, faith and confidence and what they're comfortable doing. And then just like Mark was talking about, the strong person has to be willing to, it says, bear with the failings of the weak. And the failings is not necessarily something you should blame them for, but maybe better to bear with their weakness. So I like the way he brings it back to Jesus. So continuing there in 15, "Let each of us please his neighbor for his good to build him up." So we're continuing with that build one another up idea. "For Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell on me." I read this and I think, well, he's brought it back to Christ. Christ didn't please himself. Think of Philippians chapter 2. Go ahead.
Others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you not only look to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. Have this mind among you, which is yours in Christ Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Let each of you look to the interest of others. So there we go. Build the others up. This is again, the advantage to reading letters from Paul is he wrote a bunch of them, and they all reinforce each other. Have this mind that Christ did, and he considered others more important than himself. Mm-hmm.
Question. I just literally had this conversation with somebody this week, and you tend to think of this as like New Testament issues, meat sacrifice to idols. But you have a lot of restaurants in Fort Mill that cater to Islamic faith, like halal meat, which is where animals are slaughtered facing Mecca while being chanted over, about Allah. And so it's like, it's just weird to me because it's like, I don't want to patronize a restaurant that caters to this, whether it's one item on their menu or, the entire menu. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's cruelty to animals to me. And I know American meat has to be killed. It has to be, the blood has to be drained, etc. But at least they're either gassed to where they're unconscious or they're stunned and they don't realize what's going on. I don't want to think about it too in depth, but whenever I see halal on a menu, I'm like, oh, I'm just so uncomfortable even eating in this establishment anymore because I feel like they're catering to Islamic people, and that is totally anti-Christ.
Right. Interesting question. Honestly, had never thought of it, but if you didn't hear, the question came up about restaurants that and I may have the terminology or use it wrong, but halal food, things that are approved for that faith. And I mean, hadn't really thought about it, just doing this on the fly. But I would think that this very much applies, if you're fine doing it, then you can recognize that it means nothing and go ahead and eat. But on the other hand, if it bothers you, certainly don't do it. Go ahead, Matt.
I think it's really, the big theme that you're about to get into in 15 is putting other people above ourselves. And you said not being someone, like in 1 Corinthians 9, it says in verse 19, "For though I am free from all men I've made myself a slave to all, that I might win the more. And then he says in 22, to the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save them.
Mm-hmm.
So the point is looking at the needs of the other person versus our own.
Yes.
I think he answered that in Romans chapter 14 at the end of it, from 20 through 23. He says, "Do not for the sake of food destroy the work of God. Everything indeed is clean, but is it wrong for anyone to make another stumble by what he eats? Is it good not to eat meat? It is good not to eat meat or drink wine or anything that causes your brother to stumble. The faith that you have, keep between yourself and God. Blessed is the one who has no reason to pass judgment on himself for what he approves. But whoever has doubts is condemned if he eats, because the eating is not in faith. For whatever does not proceed from faith is sin." Another translation says, "Whatever is not faith is sin." If that bothers you, don't do it.
If it bothers you, don't do it. That's true.
Well, but more importantly, it's not about whether it bothers you, don't do it. It doesn't bother somebody else. I can't see the discussion across the way over there about eating halal meat. Well, it may not be a bad thing, but I wouldn't invite her to go with me. And that's not, that's what, it goes back to Matt's point. It's, we have to take into account other people's views, and instead of judging those people on those views, we need to kind of accept that and try our best not to offend in the Lord.
Right. Go ahead, Jamie.
So every time we cover these verses, you end up at this sort of stalled place where it's like the weaker brother gets to be permanently offended and therefore must always be accommodated. And I don't believe that's a scriptural position, right? We are all called to grow, right? And you can't say it's a weak position and then say I have no need to grow.
Right.
Right, so I think the turnabout to what Mark said is, I shouldn't invite someone to go and eat at this place if I know they have a problem with it. Neither should they condemn me because I've chosen to eat there.
Right, and that is very much emphasized earlier in chapter 14, that, if you are the weaker brother, you should not be passing judgment. And to your point, we all should be striving to grow and to help our brothers and sisters grow. So maybe working with them through that issue.
Yes, I couldn't hear all the comments, but I'm going to add in. I'm going to go with scripture. We have to realize Christ has given us more freedom than we realize. Now, when I read these few verses from the New Living Translation, it makes it plain. Verse 22, you may believe there's nothing wrong with what you are doing, but keep it between yourself and God. Blessed are those who don't feel guilty for doing something they have decided is right. 23, but if you have doubts about whether or not you should eat something, you are sinning if you go ahead and do it, for you are not following your conviction. If you do anything you believe is not right, you are sinning. In all this, we have freedom. If you believe that to you, now that's between you and God. When you bless your food, that's all depends on your faith. And so sometimes we get caught up in things that God didn't place in front of us. And I believe I heard Mark say, I heard a little bit, that he was saying not inviting someone somewhere that you know that has a problem with that. Or let's say personally, I use Mark for example. Let's say that my wife like to have a little dinner wine. This just for example. We like to have dinner wine. And he has a problem with that. Well, it would be wise for me not to bring that up. Sometimes we speak too much. If we look at the Old Testament proverb, this is what Proverbs says. A fool believes everything he hears and tells everything that he knows. Some things you need to keep to yourself. Bottom line.
That's right. The faith that you have, keep between yourself and God, right? I'm not just disagreeing with you, by the way. But that does make an excellent point that, you know, in these areas where we do have freedom, you know, don't bring it up. You know, is that mutually upbuilding for you to bring up something that you know is going to cause a problem? No, that is not mutually upbuilding. I don't think I have to wait for an answer on that one. So that's the attitude, you know. If we are looking at our brother with grace the same way, you know, God looks at us with grace, we're going to be gentle. We're going to, you know, teach them, but don't purposely offend them. Okay, so we need to move on. We could go on this for a while. Later in chapter 15, beginning in verse 8, for I tell you that Christ became a servant to the circumcised, and here he's tying back in this same thought of Jesus being a servant, and we alluded to Philippians 2. Christ became a servant to the circumcised, that means to the Jews, to show God's truthfulness, in order to confirm the promises given to the patriarchs. So he's pointing to one side, the Jewish history, but then he adds, and this was, Jesus became a servant to the circumcised to confirm the promises, and in order that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy. So now Paul's going back once again to this same theme that he started from the very beginning of the book, in that the Jews and the Gentiles are all in the same place ultimately with God. They may have got to where they are by a different path, but the Gentiles were part of the plan. And then he quotes several Old Testament verses that the Jews, when these things were originally written, would have never dreamed could be tied into saving the Gentiles. But verses like, therefore I will praise you among the Gentiles and sing to your name. Rejoice, O Gentiles, with his people. Then in verse 12, the root of Jesse, and this is a reference to Jesus, the root of Jesse will come, even he who arises to rule the Gentiles. In him will the Gentiles hope. So here, like I said, Paul is coming back again to this thing of, you know, in these conflicts, when you have people who are, you know, worried about what they're eating, some people who are not, people who, and we didn't even, notice we didn't talk about the special days. That's one that doesn't seem to, I guess we have no urges to keep a Sabbath day, so it doesn't make as much of a conversation. But nevertheless, in all of these conflicts, you know, he's saying that you all are in the same place. And Christ came so that we could have hope. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that by the power of the Holy Spirit you may abound in hope. And that's our memory verse for chapter 15. So once again, we've tied it again. You're all in the same place. You all need grace. And now you all should have hope through Jesus. Okay, we're going to jump ahead quite a bit into chapter 16. So 16 starts off with a bunch of personal greetings. I'm not going to read through all of those. It can be a fun little exercise if you like pronouncing strange to us names. And some of these, there are references to other places in the Bible. He mentions Priscilla and Aquila there in verse 3, who are definitely associated with Paul. But then he does put in a section in between the greetings from verses 17 to 19. I appeal to you, brothers, to watch out for those who cause divisions and create obstacles contrary to the doctrine that you have been taught, and avoid them. Avoid those who cause division. What have we been spending several chapters, actually almost the whole book, with Paul urging us to have? Unity, yes. Now, he starts off from the beginning. We've got the Greeks or the Gentiles and the Jews, and they have friction. No, you're all in the same place. You all have sinned. You all need grace. And then he gets into specific issues. And then here at the end, he says, watch out for those who cause divisions. And a couple of interesting phrases. They serve their own appetites. If someone is serving their own appetite, are they pursuing what builds up? No. Okay, so that's our verse for chapter 16. I appeal to you, brothers, to watch out for those who cause divisions and create obstacles, contrary to the doctrine that you've been taught, and to avoid them. Obviously, we can focus in on here about contrary to the doctrine, but I think just as important, maybe more so, is watch out for those who cause divisions. They're creating obstacles, and this contrary to the doctrine is a description of the obstacles. But Paul is really pushing, watch out for division. Avoid people that cause problems. Okay. Mm-hmm.
The last chapter, but
Go ahead.
I think these are the people that are offended by everything. You can't, you try not to be a stumbling block, but they're offended by everything because they're trying to divide. So that kind of goes with what I was going to say for the last chapter.
That's right. There are some people who, like you said, are offended by everything. You can, just in the way that I'm sure we all know someone who just likes to be unhappy and complain. That there are people with that outlook on life, unfortunately. And you're going to have some people that will complain, will be offended no matter what we do. So avoid them. There you go. Okay, so to wind us up, we've got 7 minutes. This will be quickly. Chapter 1 started off. So y'all call these out so we can get through here in 7 minutes. We've got 30 seconds each. Chapter 1's theme was what? Say it again. Sin for the Gentiles specifically. And then that makes chapter 2 easier. What's chapter 2 theme? The Jews have sinned. Yes, Paul followed that. And then chapter 3, they all go together. We all have sinned. And 3 is really important because then it says, and you have sinned, speaking to the Christians, and are saved by grace. Okay, then chapter 4, I remember chapters 4 and 5 because they introduce discussion of 2 different people whose names begin with A. So chapter 4 is who? Abraham. Got to get up to catch up. So Abraham and faith. Abraham did what? And it was counted to him as righteousness. Believed. So Abraham and faith. Then chapter 5. Adam is the other A name. And this is starting to get a little more complicated. The verse for this one was 5:18, which was, for by one man's, I'm paraphrasing, sin or offense, transgression, what came to all? Death. There we go. But then the contrast of that, through another man's act of what? Righteousness, all have life. So Adam brought death and Christ brings life. Chapter 6, one of my favorites. What's the contrast in chapter 6? That's right. Be dead to sin and be alive to God. So this is that transition from being in sin to being alive. And Paul talks about this and makes a really good discussion about baptism. So yes, be dead to sin and alive to God. Chapter 7 is famous for, and this is not our verse, famous for the verse that says, I do the things I don't want to do and I don't do the things I want to do. So what's 7 about? Yes, struggle is the discussion, but that verse says, who will deliver, O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me? So it's about the struggle. Chapter 8 changes gears for a little bit. What does chapter 8 emphasize? Deliverance through the Spirit. Yes, there's lots of discussion of the Spirit in chapter 8. Chapter 8, I put down a couple of verses. One is, there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And then towards the end of the chapter, in all these things we are more than conquerors. Okay, chapter 9. So now Paul takes all this stuff we've been talking about and he gives some analogies to help people understand. So 9 is children of what? The promise. For not all those who are children of the flesh are children of God, but the children of promise. Those who are children through that promised blessing where Abraham was told, through you all nations will be blessed. So if you're in the church, if you're in Him, you are children of the promise. Chapter 10 is about salvation. But 10 rehashes this theme of multiple groups. So salvation for all of those groups, whether you're Jew, whether you're Gentile, you have access to salvation. Chapter 11 is another one of those analogies. So 11, he brings up an olive tree. So what's the analogy in the olive tree? That's right. That's that really interesting discussion of grafting a limb or pruning it out. So the question is, have you been pruned out or have you been grafted in? And remember that there's that option, even if you have been pruned, you can be grafted back in. So I think is a really beautiful discussion there. Chapter 12, this is where we get into the application. So, what's that?
Like, how we live?
Yeah, how we live. Because of the first section that's talking about interactions in the church, I just said grace within the church and grace outside of the church. But yes, it's all about living, how you treat others. Chapter 13, I'm going to have to finish this off, I think, is "Oh, only love." This is the one that says, you should only owe no man nothing except love. Chapter 14 is more discussion of conflict. And the positive way is pursue peace and the building up. Chapter 5, whoops. Well, okay. I don't know why it disappeared. Chapter 15 is, there we are. Chapter 15 was hope for all. And chapter 16 had those greetings and this advice to watch out and avoid the troublemakers. Okay, we had a table that had a lot of these concepts on it. No time to go over that. But as Paul finished his first section with a doxology, and now he finishes the book with another doxology, I thought it would be good to finish. It's a bit of a complex sentence, but reading it from verses 25 to 7. Now to him who is able to strengthen you according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery that was kept secret for long ages, but has now been disclosed and through the prophetic writings has been made known to all nations, according to the command of the eternal God, to bring about the obedience of faith. So he's stacking several things, so I'm going to go back and repeat the beginning. Now to him who is able to strengthen you, according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ. And in verse 27, to him, to the only wise God, be glory forevermore through Jesus Christ. Thought that was a good closing. Okay, we are out of time. Thank you for all the comments over the last quarter.